Hey guys, welcome to part 4. Something I don't always do, but I decided to do for this piece is put together a little mood board for the various areas of the image that I'd like to address and the particular reference that excites me for those areas. And this is something I'll keep offhand and out of maybe on my second monitor while I'm working to get some idea of the kind of shapes, colors, designs that I would like to stick into my 3D scene. And I began with the part that I felt was the strongest, which was right up here, this piece here, this photograph. And I took this into 3D and I started to build it out as being potentially the center of my image, or at least a part of the image, as I know that in the brief I wanted to have some kind of area where people could pass through as a part of the terminal. And next door, I just have the reference that I've showed you before, but I've ordered it in terms of the checkpoint information disk. We've got lighting over here, so stuff that influences me for lighting. We've got the architecture. In fact, I really like the shape here, so I took it out, and I really like this idea here, so I also extracted it. And the furniture and details, and this is to look at materials, lighting, especially this beautiful velvet carpet down here, what's happening with these pillars and the light. So I took a lot of these ideas and I moved towards the 3D, and I really love these lamps here. So let me just show you some of the early renders that I did. Here you can see the design we had before. I did it quickly in a sort of gray box style, and I put some glass walls around it, and then I duplicated it, and I put in some screens for an early test to see what it might look like and how the lighting might affect this area. I also put in these old images for this old design here from the original design to see how the light would play with the environment and if it would look cool. And I really liked some of the light coming in here. And this is quite similar to one of the thumbnails that we were working on. And I decided to put some chairs in the background. And while I was working on this, I realized that my light might be obscured because of the size of my screen, so I might not see what's happening outside on this side. So I thought maybe I could have an opening over here where we could see the silhouette of the details in the background, and that way we could avoid painting a lot of detail back there. Um, so let's move on. So here's an early light test. This is me just throwing a massive light in the scene and using some um, what's it called? Global illumination to see how the light would be bouncing around and how it would reflect. And I also decided that maybe we could put a walkway up here and how that might look. So here's another test. Here's another. Here we can see the lighting is a bit more controlled. I managed to move the sun and sky to one side and render some kind of lighting on the floor here, which is what we had in our original image. And it's something I wanted to keep. So moving forward, that's something I pushed for, and I was sort of playing around with where do I put this light and how does it strike the canvas? Is it going to go across this way? Is it going to go across this way? Is it going to go towards the back? Do we want any light back here at all? Do we want some kind of other effect? Then I started to drop in more props. I found some chairs, a free chair model, which I decided to edit moving forward because I didn't like the way these cushions were positioned and how they looked. So I flattened them out and I repositioned things. And at this point of the image, I really like what I've managed to do, which is break up the light from just hitting the surface of the floor and being quite boring to something that looks like it's interacting with the scene and setting up areas perhaps of visual interest. And from that point, I decided, oh, maybe we could put a figure here and have the light pour onto that figure, and that could be the center of our um, composition. And that could be the focus of our composition. And so I was looking at some of the shapes being a bit too square here, and just really wanted to bring these designs to a rounder, softer look for our image. And here's another render. At this point, I started to drop in some of the figures before I actually started rounding off these edges. And these are some DAS models that I threw in for scale. And I think this is really important to do in terms of just laying out your image and asking yourself, how are you going to control the crowds? And in our original brief, I remember writing that I wanted this to be quite a quiet scene and a morning scene. And so I thought having this many figures would be too many people already, and you're already starting to get that impression that this is a busy place. And that was not my original intention, so I decided to scale it back a bit later. Here I moved the figure into position for the composition, and at this point I sort of realized my composition isn't exactly in the center of frame, but it's very close. And so I wanted to be on either side and have a little bit more space. So I repositioned the camera and centered my figure in one of the thirds of the image. And here I felt like I already had quite a strong composition. I've got some really nice foreground close-up elements. I've got some nice mid-ground detail here. And of course, I've got some beautiful silhouettes in the background with potentially a scene that I can paint in the background. From here, I adjusted some of the lighting and brightened up the scene. Um, Here I started already starting to think about the materials and their reflections and glossiness and potentially what they might bring to the scene in terms of lighting and give that sci-fi feel to the image. Here in the background, you can see the influence from the mood board that I had, in which I mentioned I extracted this beautiful shape here, which is something that already looks cool. So put it right in there. And it's not entirely important what's happening in the background here, so much as it is that we believe that there's something happening back there. I decreased the amount of figures, as you can see, and I have this beautiful honeycomb type wall here, which is quite modern and futuristic looking, and totally replaced our original design. I also darkened up the carpets here from being quite a bright color to matching our original concept, which was a darker carpet. And I think that contrasts quite nicely with the lighter materials on the chairs. And so already I'm starting to play with materials, I'm starting to play with colors, I'm starting to think what could this image look like in the end. And that led me to this jump, which is I wanted to create a softer, more appealing, more calming effect to this image. So I increased the color on these guys and I put a little bit of pink back here to soften up that color and to sort of play off the warm light that's coming through the window and add a bit more of a maybe a feminine quality to this piece. I'm not quite sure, but the original holograms that I had in the original piece were magenta, and so I thought of bringing that color back in here, and later you'll see that I changed this figure in the foreground to have her arm out as if being the one who is interacting with that screen. Here she is already modified, and this was going to be the sort of final shot until I moved the camera into a better position to really take advantage of seeing more of this character, more of this interaction back here, which I'm hoping to somehow play as a secondary focus point. I think that this is going to be the struggle of this painting, is to really just control that I want this to be the main important thing, and maybe your eye shifts down here a little bit, maybe it shifts over here, having a little bit more interest in this area. We'll see, we'll see. You can see I started playing with the shapes up here to bring it back towards the sort of curvature that I had in my original concept. And I darkened up the scene so that I could have more play with the colors and everything. So let's jump into Photoshop and first let me jump into Maya and actually show you how the scene is laid out. As you can see, I only really model mostly what you might see when I render. And in this way, it's a lot like a film set. You don't really build what the camera doesn't see. And if an art director was to say, oh, I'd prefer a shot from over here, can we get one of those? Or can we get a close-up over here? We have some options to play with, and we can render out different scenes and different levels of detail, maybe do some character art. And maybe we want to see a sort of corridor position. We can start editing this area. We can start playing with it. We can maybe look through a window. There's a lot of options when you have a 3D scene like this that you can really play around with. Kept my original window here in case I needed it. So this is my setup. Here's my sun and how it's pouring through the window and how I controlled that. And my camera, as you can see, is set up here with an aim, and that's how I set up my scene. Now there are a lot of small little issues like these not being perfect, or there's not a lot of design in this piece yet in terms of what are these materials, etc. But A lot of that I'm hoping to solve in the painting and texture phase of my Photoshop painting. So a lot of these figures I'm using not only for proportion but for 3D positioning as well, in terms of knowing exactly where the forms are going to sit and how they might flow and in what direction. And when I start photo manipulating textures and clothes and characters into these positions, I want them to be as accurate as possible in terms of scale and perspective. So let's jump into Photoshop, where I can show you the final render that I have. And I want to show you that this image here is actually the final render. And I created a clown pass, which is really just creating a surface material that has no lighting information and then rendering that out. And what this effectively helps me do is isolate areas using the Magic Wand tool in Photoshop so that I can run to those areas, create masks, and manipulate the materials and textures, which is the first step that I'll show you in part 5. And before I show you that, I want to show you some additional render elements that I created. Here's a depth pass that I rendered with the 3D, and this is particularly useful to create atmosphere and background-foreground separation. And it's just one of those tools I like to have in my tool bag when I want to recall it. So if later on during the texture and painting phase I lose some of the depth in my painting, I can use this layer with various blending modes and bring back that sense of depth that I might eliminate through overpainting. I also rendered a lighting pass just to have more control over an area of light where I might want to change the color of light or just to see it in a more plain way. And those are the render passes. I haven't got anything on my first painting layer over here. So when I brought this into Photoshop, the first thing I wanted to correct was the depth and contrast. So I adjusted the depth, and I also made the glass back here using the clown pass as a selection tool to bring out that glass a little bit more and make it more obvious in the image. And then I laid in a basic blue filter to bring it closer to our original image over here. And even though our image setups are quite different, I do quite like this new image, and I'm looking forward to rendering it in the next phase. So thanks for watching, guys, and I hope that this process is interesting to you, and I hope you really enjoy the final process of laying in textures and painting. Thanks.